Something has shifted behind the scenes, and the person who once made you feel like you were the one being replaced is suddenly carrying a happiness you may not understand. Not because everything went the way they expected, but because the third party they chose over you has revealed something they never saw coming. There is a reason their heart feels strangely lighter today, and there is a reason your name has quietly entered their thoughts again. But what happened between them is only the beginning. Because the choice they thought would take them farther away from you may have brought them face to face with the truth they were desperately trying to avoid. And before you judge what you are about to hear, pause for a moment. There is something important you need to understand about this person's happiness. It may not be the happiness you imagine. Sometimes a person smiles because they finally got what they thought they wanted. And sometimes they smile because, after chasing something outside themselves, they suddenly realize what they had been searching for was never really there. Today, something about their situation feels different. A conversation may have happened. A realization may have settled into their heart. Or perhaps someone said something that forced them to look at their own choices from a completely different perspective. And strangely enough, the moment they began understanding their decision, they also began remembering you. Not the arguments. Not the distance. Not the painful moments. They remembered the feeling of being understood. They remembered the way you could sense something was wrong without demanding an explanation. They remembered the comfort of your presence. And that memory became much louder than they expected. You see, child, people can walk away from a person. But they cannot always walk away from the emotional truth that person awakened inside them. That is why today may feel unusual. Their attention may be somewhere else, yet their thoughts keep circling back to something unfinished. And here is where the story takes a surprising turn. Because the third party may have given them something they wanted for a while, attention, excitement, validation, or the feeling of being chosen. But there is a difference between being desired and being deeply known. There is a difference between someone making you feel wanted for a moment and someone recognizing the parts of you that you rarely show anyone. And that difference is beginning to matter. Perhaps this person once believed that choosing someone else would make their life easier. Perhaps they convinced themselves that they had made the right decision. Maybe they even tried to silence every thought of you. But the heart has a strange way of preserving what mattered most. A song. A familiar place. A quiet evening. A random memory. One little detail can suddenly unlock an entire chapter they thought they had closed. And today, something may have triggered exactly that. The most unexpected part is that they are not necessarily sitting there feeling miserable. They may actually feel happy. Because something has finally become clear. They are beginning to understand why certain things never felt completely right. They are beginning to see why the connection they chose did not erase the connection they had with you. And that realization can bring a strange kind of peace. Not the peace of forgetting you, but the peace of finally understanding you. There is another layer to this that I want you to hear carefully. Do not assume that their happiness means you have lost. Sometimes the greatest shift happens when you stop competing for someone's attention. When you stop explaining your worth. Stop proving your loyalty. Stop chasing answers. And simply allow life to reveal what words could never prove. Your silence may have taught them something your conversations never could. Your distance may have given them room to recognize your absence. And the life you continued building without them may have shown them that your love was never about possession. It was about presence. That realization can be powerful. Because when someone understands that you were never trying to control them, never trying to force them, never trying to hold them captive, they begin looking at your love through completely different eyes. And that is where their happiness becomes connected to you in a way you may not expect. They may be happy today because something they chose has finally settled down enough for them to think clearly. The noise is quieter. The excitement has faded into reality. And in that quiet, your memory has become impossible to ignore. But there is one specific thought they may have had that changes everything. A thought that sounds simple, yet carries the weight of everything they never said. It is the question they have been avoiding. What if I chose the wrong person? And child, that question is not the end of this story. It is the doorway. Because once someone sincerely asks themselves that question, they cannot easily return to the version of themselves that existed before it. Something inside them has already moved. And very soon, you may understand why their happiness today is connected to a revelation that has absolutely nothing to do with what you first assumed. Because what they discovered about the third party is about to expose what they truly discovered about you. There was a moment they never expected to have, a moment so ordinary on the outside, yet powerful enough to change the way they saw everything. They were listening to someone speak, watching a familiar situation unfold, when suddenly something inside them went completely still. Because for the first time, they noticed what had been missing. Not excitement. Not attention. Not companionship. Something deeper. Emotional safety. And that realization did not arrive with an argument or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, almost painfully, through a small moment that reminded them of you. Maybe it was the way someone responded when they were vulnerable. Maybe it was the absence of the understanding they once received from you. Maybe they simply looked across the room and realized, I can't talk to this person the way I used to talk to them. That thought stayed with them. And what happened next made the situation even more complicated. Because instead of becoming angry, they became reflective. They began comparing feelings they had tried very hard not to compare. With the third party, perhaps everything looked right from the outside. But with you, there had been something difficult to explain. Something that did not need constant effort to feel real. And now they were beginning to understand that difference. You were not simply someone they had loved. You had become a reference point. A quiet standard their heart kept returning to whenever something felt incomplete. That is why their happiness today may look confusing. They may genuinely feel relieved. Relieved because they finally understand what their past was trying to teach them. Relieved because they no longer have to keep pretending that every choice they made was perfect. And relieved because admitting the truth to themselves is the first step toward emotional freedom. But there is something they have not admitted yet. Not even completely to themselves. They miss the way you made them feel. And that is very different from simply missing someone's presence. They miss being understood without having to explain every emotion. They miss the warmth that existed in conversations that seemed ordinary at the time. They miss knowing that someone cared about the little things. And perhaps most of all, they miss the version of themselves that existed around you. That version was softer. More honest. Less guarded. And now they are realizing that the person they chose afterward could never manufacture that feeling. No matter how much they tried. No matter how much they convinced themselves. There is another revelation coming, though. Because their realization did not stop with you. It forced them to look at their own behavior. They may finally be asking themselves why they walked away. Why they allowed outside influence to affect their decision. Why they listened to temporary emotions instead of deeper feelings. And that question is uncomfortable. Because when someone stops blaming circumstances, they are left staring directly at their own choices. That can be a painful kind of awakening. But it can also be the beginning of genuine change. And something about today's energy suggests they are no longer interested in running from that truth. They may not know what to do with it yet. They may not have the perfect words. They may even be afraid that reaching toward you would reopen a door they once closed. But their heart has already begun knocking. Quietly. Patiently. Almost cautiously. And you may wonder. If they are thinking about me, why haven't they said anything? There is a reason. Sometimes the hardest message to send is the one that requires someone to admit they were wrong. Because saying, "I miss you," is easy. Saying, "I finally understand what I lost," requires vulnerability. And saying, "I chose someone else, but I still couldn't escape what I felt for you," requires a level of honesty that many people spend years avoiding. That is why their silence should not automatically be interpreted as indifference. Silence can sometimes mean someone is trying to gather the courage to face the consequences of their own truth. But do not mistake this for a promise that they will suddenly appear tomorrow. Your path is not supposed to depend on waiting by a door. You are being reminded of something much more important. Your worth was never determined by whether this person chose you first. Your value existed before their decision. It existed during their absence. And it will continue to exist regardless of what they decide next. That is the part they may finally be beginning to understand. They did not create your value by loving you. They simply had the opportunity to recognize it. And now, they may be looking back with a completely different heart. There is one memory, however, that seems to stand above all the others. One moment they keep replaying. One moment that makes them wonder whether they walked away from something they were never meant to abandon. And when that memory returns again, it brings with it a question they can no longer push aside. The question is not whether they still have feelings. Deep down, they already know the answer. The real question is whether they are brave enough to finally do something about them. And what happens when that question reaches its breaking point is where this story becomes even more unexpected. Something happened after that realization that they did not plan for. They stopped trying to convince themselves. For a while, they had been telling themselves that everything was fine. That they had made their choice. That the past belonged in the past. That whatever happened between you had already served its purpose. But then came one quiet moment when there was nobody around to impress. And the truth became louder than the story they had been telling themselves. They realized they were no longer asking, "Why do I still remember them?" They were asking something far more dangerous. Why did I ever let them go? That question changed the atmosphere inside them. Suddenly, memories they had buried began returning with unusual clarity. Not the dramatic moments. The small ones. The moments that seemed meaningless at the time. The way you listened. The way you noticed changes in their mood. The way you could make an ordinary conversation feel strangely important. The way you stayed genuine when they were expecting you to perform. And perhaps the memory that hurt the most was realizing that they had once had access to something they now understood was rare. Your presence. Not your attention. Not your messages. Not what you could give them. Your presence. There is a difference. And they are finally beginning to feel it. The third party may have brought something exciting into their world, but excitement eventually becomes familiar. Attention eventually becomes normal. And when the noise fades, character becomes visible. That is when comparisons begin without anyone asking for them. They may have noticed how differently they felt after certain conversations. How often they had to explain themselves. How often they felt misunderstood. How often they were surrounded by someone yet still emotionally alone. And that realization may have shocked them. Because they began to understand that being with someone is not the same as feeling connected to them. You had given them a kind of emotional recognition they did not fully appreciate until it disappeared. And now something else is happening. They are looking at their own past behavior with more honesty. Maybe they remember the times you reached out and they responded coldly. Maybe they remember moments when you were trying to communicate while they were too distracted by another possibility. Maybe they remember a moment when you needed reassurance and they gave you uncertainty instead. Those memories can be uncomfortable. But they are also revealing. Because regret does not always arrive as tears. Sometimes regret looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like staring at an old message without knowing what to say. Sometimes it looks like opening someone's profile and closing it again. Sometimes it looks like typing a sentence. then deleting it. And there may be more hesitation here than you realize. Because they know that if they come back into your life, they cannot simply pretend nothing happened. They would have to explain themselves. They would have to acknowledge the choices they made. They would have to face the possibility that you may not receive them the way you once did. And that possibility scares them. Not because you have become cruel, but because you have changed. Your energy is different now. You are no longer standing in the same emotional place where they left you. You have learned something. You have healed something. You have become less willing to accept confusion as love. And whether they know it consciously or not, they can sense that. That is why their next move may not be dramatic. It may begin with something incredibly small. A question. A reaction. A casual message. A reason to reopen communication. Something that looks insignificant on the surface, but carries much more emotion underneath. And before that happens, they may be testing something within themselves. They may be asking, would they even want to hear from me? Would they forgive me? Have they moved on? Do they still feel anything? Those questions can become overwhelming when someone realizes they no longer have guaranteed access to the person they once took for granted. And this is where you need to pay attention. Because their happiness today may actually be connected to a sense of freedom. They are beginning to feel free from pretending. Free from defending a choice simply because they made it. Free from forcing themselves to believe that one decision determines the rest of their emotional life. And that freedom allows them to admit something they once considered impossible. You still matter. Maybe more than they wanted to admit. But there is one final piece they have not understood yet. They know they miss you. They know the third-party connection did not erase what existed between you. They know their choices created distance. But they still have not fully understood why your absence affected them so deeply. That answer is about to emerge. And when it does, they will realize that what they lost was not simply a relationship. They lost a mirror. Someone who reflected a version of them they actually wanted to become. And that realization may be the reason their heart is finally preparing for the conversation they have postponed for far too long. Because the words they have been holding back are no longer staying silent. The words almost came out. Then they stopped. For a few seconds, they simply stared at the message they had started writing, realizing that one honest sentence could change everything between you. They had written your name. Then erased it. Typed again. And paused. Because suddenly this was no longer about missing you. It was about admitting why they had left. And that truth carried more weight than they expected. For so long, they had convinced themselves that choosing someone else was simply a different direction in life. They told themselves they were following their feelings. They told themselves they would eventually stop thinking about what happened between you. But now they are beginning to see something painfully clear. They did not simply choose another person. They chose a version of life that looked easier from the outside. And today, they are finally seeing the difference between what looks right and what feels right deep within the heart. That realization can be strangely peaceful. Because once the illusion breaks, a person no longer has to keep fighting their own memories. They can finally say, I understand now. And that may be the real reason they feel happier today. Not because everything around them is perfect, but because something inside them has finally stopped fighting the truth. There is a quiet relief in that. The kind of relief that comes when someone stops pretending they do not care. When they stop forcing themselves to forget. When they stop asking why your memory keeps returning at the most unexpected moments. And perhaps the most surprising realization is this. They are no longer angry at you. They may once have blamed circumstances. They may have blamed timing. They may have blamed misunderstandings. They may even have convinced themselves that you were somehow responsible for the distance between you. But now, their perspective is changing. They are beginning to recognize the choices that were actually theirs. And that can awaken something powerful. Accountability. Not shame. Not self-punishment. Just honesty. They are seeing where they could have listened more carefully. Where they could have communicated instead of withdrawing. Where they allowed someone else's presence to influence a decision that should have been made from the heart. And this is where your story becomes very different from what you may have imagined. Because you were never meant to spend your life proving that you were the better choice. You were never supposed to compete with another person for love. You were never supposed to convince someone of your worth. If someone truly understands your value, they eventually recognize it without being forced. And that recognition is beginning to happen now. Perhaps slowly. Perhaps imperfectly. But unmistakably. There is also something they may be noticing about you from a distance. You did not collapse when they walked away. You kept moving. You kept growing. You kept becoming someone they could no longer associate with the version of you they once knew. And that has changed the balance completely. Because they once believed you would always be emotionally available. Now they are realizing. They may not know where they stand with you anymore. That uncertainty is powerful. Not because you are trying to make them jealous. Not because you are playing a game. But because you finally stopped placing your life on pause. And sometimes the strongest message a person can send is not a message at all. It is the life they continue living. The peace they build. The confidence they regain. The boundaries they create. The smile that returns after a season of disappointment. That is what can make someone look back and wonder. How did I ever fail to see this? And there is another detail you need to understand. The third party may not even realize what is happening inside this person's heart. From the outside, everything may look normal. They may laugh together. They may continue their routine. They may appear completely comfortable. But appearances do not always reveal emotional truth. A person can be physically present somewhere, while emotionally standing somewhere else. And lately, this person's mind keeps wandering toward a place they thought they had left behind. Toward you. Toward the possibility of what might have been. Toward the conversation they never had. And now that conversation is becoming more difficult to avoid. Because there is something they want to ask you. Not something casual. Not something designed to test your attention. Something deeply vulnerable. They want to know whether the door is completely closed. Or whether there is still a small space where honesty could enter. But before they ask you that question, they need to face one final fear. The fear that you may have healed so completely. That they no longer have a place in your future. And that possibility is beginning to haunt their thoughts. Because for the first time, they are realizing that losing you was not the greatest consequence of their choice. The greatest consequence was becoming the person who has to live with knowing they once had something precious. And did not recognize it in time. And just when they begin accepting that possibility, something unexpected happens. A sign appears. A conversation. A memory. A coincidence. Something that makes them stop and wonder whether life is giving them one final opportunity to speak the truth. And what they decide to do with that moment may reveal everything they have been too afraid to say. What if the moment they have been waiting for is already closer than either of you realizes? Because something has changed in the way they are thinking about you. They are no longer simply remembering the past. They are imagining a conversation in the present. They are wondering what your voice would sound like if they finally told you everything they had been hiding. And that thought has become strangely comforting. For the first time, they are not imagining how to impress you. They are imagining how to be honest. That difference matters. Because when someone stops trying to control the outcome and starts wanting to tell the truth, something inside them has already shifted. They may not know whether you would welcome them. They may not know whether you would forgive them. They may not even know whether they deserve another opportunity. But they know one thing. Silence no longer feels as comfortable as it once did. There is a sentence they keep coming back to. Not because it is complicated, but because it carries everything they could not say before. I should have handled things differently. Those words may never have been spoken aloud. Yet inside their heart, they are becoming impossible to ignore. And perhaps this is the hidden reason they seem happier today. They are no longer trapped inside the need to defend their past. They can finally admit that they made choices from a place of confusion. They can admit that the third-party connection gave them something they thought they needed. But they can also admit that it did not replace what they had with you. That realization does not necessarily mean everything will instantly change. It means they can finally see clearly. And clarity can be more powerful than emotion. Emotion can make someone run toward you one day and away from you the next. Clarity makes them stop, think, and understand. That is what seems to be happening now. They are beginning to understand that your connection was never simply about attraction. It was about recognition. You recognized something in them that they had not fully recognized in themselves. And perhaps that is why your absence became so noticeable. The third party could occupy their time, but could not silence the questions inside them. They could create new memories, but could not erase the old ones. They could offer attention, but could not recreate the emotional language you and this person once shared. And eventually, the comparison stopped being between two people. It became a comparison between two versions of their own life. The life where they followed what seemed easiest, and the life where they listened to what felt deeply meaningful. That is a difficult truth to face. But they are facing it. And something else may surprise you. They are beginning to understand your silence differently. Before, they may have interpreted it as anger, or pride, or an attempt to punish them. Now they may be realizing you were simply protecting your peace. You were tired of carrying the emotional weight of a decision you did not make. You were tired of wondering where you stood. You were tired of giving explanations to someone who had already chosen a different direction. So you stepped back. And your stepping back became a message more powerful than any paragraph you could have written. It told them, I will love you, but I will not abandon myself to prove it. That is the lesson they may finally be learning. And it is one they cannot unlearn. Because now, whenever they think about returning, they understand that coming back would require more than words. It would require consistency. It would require honesty. It would require them to approach you with respect instead of expectation. And that is why they are hesitating. Not because the feeling is weak, but because the consequences are real. They know that if they reach out, they cannot simply say, hey, how have you been? They may need to explain what happened. They may need to tell you what they discovered. They may need to acknowledge the person they chose over you. And most importantly, they may need to tell you why, after everything, their heart kept finding its way back to you. That conversation could change the emotional landscape completely. But there is something you should never forget while waiting for that possibility. Do not stop living. Do not measure your worth by whether someone returns. Do not turn your healing into a waiting room. If this person is meant to speak honestly, let them find the courage to do it. Your responsibility is not to chase the revelation. Your responsibility is to remain faithful to the peace you fought so hard to build. Because the most beautiful part of this story may not be that they finally recognize your value. It may be that you no longer need their recognition to know it yourself. And that is exactly why their next realization could be the most powerful one yet. They may finally understand that the person they were afraid of losing was never actually the person they chose over you. They were afraid of losing the version of themselves that only existed when they were loved by you. And once they understand that, they will have to decide whether they are ready to become that honest version of themselves again. That decision is approaching. And when the moment comes, it may begin with something so small that you almost miss its significance. A message. A name appearing on your screen. Or a simple sentence carrying years of unspoken emotion. But behind those few words, there may be an entire confession waiting to come out.